Joining us now, Gregg Jarrett, Fox News legal analyst, author of The Russian Hoax, #1 New York Times bestseller. And John Sale is a former special prosecutor, having served in the prestigious New York Southern District of New York and an assistant special Watergate prosecutor. Welcome both of you to the program. Rod Rosenstein's about to flying on Air Force One with the president, but let me ask you both first about the treatment and what is, you know, I know we're supposed to be happy when there's a victory and the good guy wins, but at what cost?
Well, you know, I will say that Susan Collins put it best. She condemned the outrageous behavior, the distortions by special interest groups, all of the activists and protesters and Democratic senators. She made it clear that their shameful tactics, the smears, the character assassination, backfired on them as far as her vote is concerned. And last night on 60 Minutes, she reiterated that. She said, look, these political threats and attempts at bribery have backfired on her. It made her steel her determination to make sure that Kavanaugh was being treated fairly with the presumption of innocence and due process. She said that is relevant to our advise and consent duty.
Let me ask you, John Sale, I know you've been in more than a few political battles in your life, and we watched this process unfold. I mean, and it got worse and worse, you know, literally crescendoing at what? When Michael Avenatti represents a woman that claims almost on a weekend basis that young girls were systematically drugged, boys lining up in the hall to rape them one after another, and that was a normal weekend, and that would happen, and not just once, but multiple times, and no parent, no law enforcement, no teacher was ever told ever. All your years in the prosecutor's office, would you be a bit suspicious at that story?
Well, you'd be more than a bit suspicious. I mean, you would just reject it out of hand. But, Sean, going forward, there's something very special about the Supreme Court. You know, the fact that the confirmation was 50-48, it's not like we're trying to beat a point spread. It's now Justice Kavanaugh. It's no longer Judge Kavanaugh. He was confirmed. And the Supreme Court just must be above the fray and not send out political signals. And I think the editorial he wrote where he said, the op-ed, that he was going to be independent and impartial, obviously he will be. And I just hope that it does not, the awful things that have happened in the last week do not affect the public's confidence in the independence of the Supreme Court.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting. And then we have to ask the question, will the party that was responsible for all of this, will there be a price to pay in 29 days? Well, I mean, in other words, I talk about every election, Republicans are racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic. They want dirty air, water, and they want to kill Granny and throw her over a cliff, and they want to kill children. Well, now it's, you know, coat hangers being sent, and it's just the same tactics.
Those tactics, I think, are backfiring on the Democrats and all of the activists and protesters and these special interest groups. The polling data, Sean, is very revealing. There was some apathy among Republicans, as is often the case in a midterm election. And suddenly that changed and transformed GOP voters into energized and motivated voters to get out on Election Day next month, because they see what is going to happen if they lose the House and the Senate, because Nancy Pelosi and Jerry Nadler, who would then become chairman of the Judiciary Committee if Democrats win the House, are vowing to exact revenge, a retribution investigation to remove Kavanaugh from the Supreme Court by virtue of articles of impeachment. And there's nothing that will motivate Republican voters more than that kind of a threat to undermine the democratic process of confirmation and to try to destabilize the Supreme Court for partisan reasons.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch. Do you think politically, John, you've watched a lot of campaigns, is the American people going to be motivated in 29 days, and are they going to remember this?
Well, I can't read the tea leaves, but what we just saw with the confirmation battle actually was an example of our separation of powers in action, where each branch exercised its appropriate role. And now, in our democracy, the people are going to decide. And, there are going to be irresponsible lawyers who are going to go on TV shows with more people who are claiming I should have been interviewed, I could have told this tale, and I just hope that people can separate the wheat from the chaff.
As a prosecutor, looking at these three cases, how would you have handled them? 36 years later, in each case, no corroboration in each case.
I don't know anything beyond what's in the public record, but without corroboration, you might entertain a meeting for an hour or two and say, thank you for coming by. There's nothing to talk about.
Okay, so when Professor Ford, for example, if she can't remember a location, she can't remember an exact date or a place, she's struggling to know the year. In the case of Miss Ramirez, she's calling other fellow students from back in the day. She's asking them if they remember because she's not sure she remembers. In the case of Julie Swetnick, who made changed her story. Well, Brett Kavanaugh gave out red Solo cups and he was near the punch bowl and I saw him in a hall, maybe not lined up in a hall, which is very different from the sworn affidavit that they had originally laid out a week before. I mean, if you look at that in a prosecutor's office, what are they going to say?
Well, they're going to say these are all frivolous accusations. But as far as we know regarding Dr. Ford, there were 9 or 10 witnesses interviewed, and people are going to say, well, there were so many more who weren't interviewed. It's not the number of interviews. It's what they have to say. And if it's all cumulative, you don't count the witnesses. But I think some of those other people, as I say now, are going to want to have their 24 hours in the sun or in the fame, and they're going to want to go to the National Enquirer or something like that.
Yeah.
But there are no criminal cases. There are no civil cases. A good man was confirmed. He's now a justice, and we need to move on.
Let's talk about the news that we are pretty confident is coming out this week. Let me just say this very obtusely, if I can, that if a top-ranking FBI official were to confirm that there was an orchestrated effort among the upper echelon within the DOJ and the FBI to go after Donald Trump for retribution for the firing of James Comey, what would that mean, Gregg Jarrett?
It would mean that this was all a hoax, the Russia hoax, and it wasn't Trump-Russia collusion.
Well, that would mean Gregg Jarrett was right from the get-go, but yes,
and the latest information only corroborates the thesis of the book. There wasn't Trump-Russia collusion, but there was Hillary Clinton-Russia collusion. She had on her payroll a British spy who was using Russian sources. And now we've learned through the interview behind closed doors of James Baker, the top FBI lawyer, that documents were being passed to him from Hillary Clinton's lawyer and the DNC's lawyer. This is astonishing information. And in fact, we've also learned that, this was part of the FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. None of it was corroborated, and federal regulations are very clear. You may not submit to the FISC information and evidence that is uncorroborated, and yet that is precisely what they did. And so I agree with you when these documents are declassified and the Inspector General has had enough time to look at them and decide, I think they will be explosive.
Is there any way that Rod Rosenstein, who signed the fourth FISA warrant, we know the basis and bulk of the information in the FISA application, John, was the unverified, uncorroborated dossier, the political document that Hillary paid for. I mean, how is it possible that they passed 4 of those? And I mean, doesn't he have to be held accountable for that?
Well, let's wait and see when the documents are declassified. But the answer to your question is, of course. We talk about the president is not above the law, and he's not, but certainly neither is the deputy attorney general. But I see one thing a little bit differently, and maybe we're going to segue into this, and that is everything you're talking about should be thoroughly investigated, but I think it's separate from what the Mueller people are doing. And I think that the Mueller investigation can conclude by showing independently that the president was just not involved in any wrongdoing. And it doesn't have to be one, or they're not necessarily linked.
Would he have an obligation? See, this is what frustrates me. I think that the mandate was so broad that we end up going into people's, bank loan applications from years gone by. To me, is just ridiculous, that considering where it was supposed to start and where it was supposed to go. Would it not lead to an important issue, especially if Russian lies were paid for and disseminated to the American people to purposely lie to them before an election, and worse than that, used in FISA applications to spy on an opposition party candidate, and then used later to destroy a presidential a president who was duly elected?
Well, 100%. And if those things are verified, the people involved should be held responsible criminally. But I'm saying that the Mueller investigation in and of itself can conclude by showing the president didn't do anything wrong. One of the dangers of a special counsel or a special prosecutor is they have only one case, so they're on a mission. But what I've always believed is if a special counsel does a thorough investigation and concludes that in this case the president did not do anything wrong, that special counsel has not failed. The special counsel has done a thorough investigation, and in this case, we haven't seen any evidence to show that Donald Trump was involved in collusion, obstruction, or whatever you want to call it.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back more with Gregg Jarrett and John Sayles. All right, as we continue with Gregg Jarrett and John Sayles, and all right, so Rod Rosenstein, why would he even be in the mix, considering we now know and have corroboration, Gregg Jarrett, that he was saying, well, what do you want me to wear a wire around the president?
Well, he has a lot to answer for, and the president, I'm sure, spoke to him about it on Air Force One today. Did you really try to get people to secretly record me? Did you recruit people to invoke the 25th Amendment to depose me from office? Now, we know Rosenstein is going to not deny it. Whenever he's caught engaging in illicit, if not illegal activities, he claims his words were misinterpreted. Over and over again, we've seen examples of that. Threats to the Intelligence Committee staff, threats to Devin Nunes. Oh, I'm just misunderstood. Rosenstein must be the most misunderstood man in Washington, D.C., but it would be imprudent politically for the president to fire him. He has no intention of doing so. Rosenstein, must receive Mueller's report, and I think the president wants to see how that will play out. And I think it's beginning to wind down. Many of the people on Mueller's staff have already left and returned their jobs at the Department of Justice. So I think that is reaching a conclusion. I agree with John. No collusion, no obstruction, and then let's launch a serious investigation with a grand jury into people at the Department of Justice and the FBI who engaged in this, what I believe to be an illicit, illegal scheme to frame Donald Trump.
We'll take a break here, but we got to say goodbye to Gregg Jarrett, John Sayles. Thank you both for being with us.
Prosecution, and I think it's a precedent that we as conservatives should be slow to set, because we will not always be in the majority. Let's go to Jenny in Indiana on line one. Jenny, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say I think you are absolutely right about Kavanaugh, and I'm so glad this whole circus ended with him getting confirmed. However, I also think that we as conservatives need to back off Ford a little bit. I think she had something that did happen to her in her life, and I think she was used by the Democrats, and I think that we as conservatives need to back off of her a little bit, because I think we're not making any friends by continuing to hound that point. But I am thrilled that Kavanaugh got confirmed. It was fair and justice for him, and I do think that what she was saying was not true when it comes to Kavanaugh. But I do think.
Well, you're absolutely right that she was used, Jenny, and I think the Republican politicians have been very gentle in their treatment of Christine Ford. What I think is that it is important to point out how false her story was, not because we're interested in pounding away on her, but because it was the Democrats who procured that false testimony. I mean, it seems to me that the target here is the Democrats. We are up against a hard break, so I'm not going to take any more calls right now. We'll take more later in the program. After the break, we are going to be joined by Heather McDonald, who is the author of a brand new book called The Diversity Delusion, which actually fits in quite well with the things we've already been talking about today, and undermine our culture. Heather, thanks for being on the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me, John. It's great to be with you.
Heather, you just within the last day or two have an article at cityjournal.org called Trauma and Truth. And it sort of casts an eye back on this ideology that has developed over the years that insists that we all must believe whatever a woman says, at least under some circumstances. And it's really the ideology that was weaponized against Judge Brett Kavanaugh.
Absolutely, and I think it's important for us to understand where it's coming from. It's coming from university campuses. What we've lived through in the last 3 weeks is basically Gender Studies 101, weaponized and turned into the real world. You have a war that's been declared by various self-described victim groups, in this case females, against everybody else. And one of the most appalling ideas that has come out of this campus rape bureaucracy, that's where this is all starting, is the idea that any female who declares herself a sexual assault victim is entitled to absolute belief on the part of anybody judging her claim. We have seen this attitude put into practice with these kangaroo courts on college campuses that have destroyed every shred of due process that Western culture has developed over the centuries to make sure that the fact finder arrives at the truth and that innocent people are not convicted. But we saw this now in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And what I've looked at, I mean, the principle is itself appalling, but it's empirically false. There are cases aplenty that I write about of females who were engaged in completely voluntary, drunken hookup sex that they either instigated or fully participated in, that for a variety of reasons, whether it's revenge or regret afterwards, then declare that they are the victims of sexual assault. But
Heather, let me just stop you there for a second, because this article at cityjournal.org, I really recommend it to our listeners. You know, you mentioned some kind of famous instances of this, you know, the mattress girl at Columbia and so on, but you lay out with respect to these cases, things like text messages that were exchanged after the fact and so on. And it's just blindingly obvious that these were consensual hookups.
Well, the mattress girl, who I pity anybody who actually had to know about this fraudulent, self-engrossed narcissist who carried around a mattress for a year or two at Columbia to protest the fact that Columbia did not, for once, expel her alleged assailant. After the sexual intercourse, which 8 months after the fact she decided was rape in order to take revenge on her partner, immediately after, she sent loving, fawning text messages, you know, Paul, I want to see you, I love you, we need to get together for another Paul Emma chill sesh. This is not the text of a female who has just gone through the most traumatic, terrifying experience any woman can have short of being murdered. This is somebody who, you know, wants to continue her sluttish involvement with this guy. And we have other examples of that. A girl who conspired to evade her friends in order to go have sex with this guy that she'd been making out with during a dorm party. She sent him a message saying, "Do you have a condom?"
This is unbelievable, yes. Heather. Let's just pause on this for a second. This is at Occidental College, Southern California, and they had been on a 24-hour drinking binge, and this girl dodges her friends so she can hook up with this guy, and they're texting back and forth beforehand. And as you say, one of the things she texts is, "Okay, do you have a condom?" And he replies, "Yes," and she texts back, "Good, give me 2 minutes." And so, the inevitable follows. And then after the fact, she apparently changes her mind for whatever reason and now claims that this guy raped her. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And not only did she say, "Do you have a condom?" And again, any guy who's asked if he has a condom is going to assume he has a willing partner. Right before she left her dorm room to go down to her tryst with this condomized guy, she sent a message to her friends saying, "I'm going to have sex now." So any guy that receives these messages is going to perfectly rationally and accurately assume that he has affirmative consent from his partner. And yet, Occidental College, who was under enormous pressure from the Obama administration that wanted to rack up as many male scalps as possible in its feminist crusade to basically right males out of Western civilization, Occidental expelled the guy. He sued the school. That case is yet to be heard, but the text message trail is completely vindicates him and exonerates him.
Yeah. There's another one you talk about where after the encounter, which again, long after the fact, is recharacterized as being rape, she texts to the boy, the boy texts to her, "How do I compare with your boyfriend?" And she replies, "You were great." And then of course after the fact she says, "No, I changed my mind. I think it was rape."
Yeah, well, these are not just isolated anecdotes. As I describe in my book, the very first campus rape survey, the one that gave rise to this epidemic of false claims and this hysterical, completely counterfactual belief that there's this epidemic of sexual assault on college campuses. The first survey that was published in 1985 in this magazine, 43% of the females whom the rape researcher classified as rape victims went on to have sex again with their alleged assailants. Now, John, I submit to you that is behavior that is completely unthinkable. If you have actually been raped, that is the most, as I say, the most terrifying experience you can come through. You feel nothing but repugnance from this violent criminal. You do not go on to voluntarily have sex again. And the key to this whole hoax is that the numbers that we have on alleged campus rape are generated by the researchers themselves. This same survey from 1985 that was published in this magazine, when the researcher asked the girls whom she classified as rape victims whether they had been raped, 73% said they had not. So the phony campus rape epidemic conceit depends on violating one of the primary norms of feminism, which we're seeing at play now with the Kavanaugh hearings, which is you always take the female at her word, except if she says she hasn't been raped, in which case you know better than she does and you declare that she has.
Heather, a couple things going on here. One is that the left has just redefined the word rape, right? I mean, they've got an ideologically motivated definition that allows them to vastly expand what any normal person would consider to be